Thank you so much for the invitation. It felt like home from the first time I landed in the airport. And I'm even more grateful as we are aware that there's no consensus whether Romania is in the Balkans or not. We had the same very strong debate when I was back in university in an international student NGO called ISEC, and there we would have clusters of countries. We would meet in conferences based on our commonalities to decide common strategies on the activities we were having. And there was no year where there was a clear decision if whether we should go with Austria and Hungary in that cluster or whether we're in the Balkans cluster. So what we were doing is that we were attending both parties and meetings. It served us well at that point. And I think Romania is still at a point where we need to embrace the place we have in geography, the place we have in history, because now we represent not just our borders, but the borders of the European Union. Some of the borders of the European Union. And so it becomes even more important, how does our generation and how does our country look at multilateralism, looks at the EU enlargement and the connection we have with the Balkans. Because there are two ways of looking at this. I mean, there might be more, but I think in the dominant discourse we have at home, there are two ways of looking at this. One, which I'm part of, is to embrace our role and to understand that the stronger our connections with the Balkans, the stronger and faster the speed of EU enlargement and integration, the better it is for Romania as well. Because we have common culture, we have common interests, and more of us at the negotiation table is going to be a stronger power for us as well. We're going to have more allies that come from the same, let's say, history in a sense. The other discourse, the other trend that is now in the conversation is the opposite of that. Is both Romania and Bulgaria were net beneficiaries of the EU funds, of the integration funds, but our reforms are not done. We still have, I would say, a way to go, a lot of investments that need still to be done. And there's also this potential competition that is perceived in terms of access to resources. And I want to speak a bit, not how we've come here or about the institutions that we have, because I think the previous speakers and most of you in the room know more about this than I do. I have no expertise to share on that topic. But I want to speak a bit about what I think can be a strong ally, but also a vulnerable spot in our common model of the world, in a sense. And that is the young generation. Why am I mentioning this? First, because of my personal experience. I was mentioning ISEC at the beginning. That is an international student NGO formed in '48 by 7 students after the World War II that thought that connections between young people, cultural exchanges, being able to visit and understand one's country can become the basis of avoiding war and conflict. 75 years later, to this day, it's spread in more than 156 countries, and they run a global survey each 2-3 years to ask young people about their values, how do they see the world, what are their intentions. Obviously, there's a bias there, it's online, it's in English, but understanding this is still amazing to see that 75% of the respondents, and this would typically be around 55,000 young people from 2,600 universities and more than 100 countries, 75% of them know about the sustainable goals. More than half of them say that they see the connection with citizens from other countries as equally important as the connections with citizens from their own country. There's an increasing sense of global identity, in a way. And that plays out in very practical terms. Like, for example, Brexit, because you were correctly mentioning it before. If you look at the difference of votes between generations, there's an estimation at about 72% of people under 24 that have voted for Remain. So it plays out in very practical terms in decisions, very concrete terms. There's also an estimation that maybe if all of them would have turned out, then they would have shifted the entire Brexit decision, in a sense. And why am I mentioning this is because I think more needs to be done culturally as well in the spaces where the conversation between young people happen. Because it's not typically the national televisions or even the cultural institutes or the conferences. It's not typically the instruments that countries have used until now to propagate cultural diplomacy or to share their identity with the world. It's happening in other spaces, mostly. It's happening directly between them without the mediation of state actors. It's happening instantly, be it TikTok or Instagram or forums. And I think that is going to be, and I know this is a very heavy word to use, especially in the context of the war in Ukraine, but I think that will be a battleground for the future elections. I think that will be a battleground for possible futures that are put forward to these children and young people. Because in the same time, they're also a generation that feels partially disenfranchised. They have the most instruments at hand than any other generation, as we did, to express themselves, to ask questions, to connect with everyone from around the world. But in the same time, it's quite clear that they perceive themselves as disenfranchised. We see this in almost every country, that the voter turnout is very, very low. It's the same in the Balkans, it's the same with the European Union members. And we see a rising tension happening in many places from that generation. So in very practical terms, I think there's a space that when we look, for example, at the investment fund and the investment framework for the Balkans, where most of the money goes to sustainable transportation, energy, climate change, business development, and human capital, that a stronger investment finds its way there towards cultural diplomacy and programs targeted at this conversation with young people and among them. Because they can be strong ambassadors of this shared cultural space, but in the same time there are vulnerabilities there that can be used by people that are maybe not so friendly with a common model. That is one thing that I think is worth mentioning. And the other is that what they perceive, for example, and this is a survey done through ISEC and a different survey done through the Global Shapers of the World Economic Forum this year, when they look at the main risks that they perceive in the future, they're very practical about it, which is the standard of the cost of living, the increasing cost of living. And so they feel that there is not just harder to get by or harder to access opportunities, although in very rational terms it's the opposite, but they feel that the institutions have failed them in a way. When they look at climate change, when they look like increasing cost of living. Even if, again, in practical terms, they are maybe in the place of most opportunity that was ever to be. So that's why engaging them, creating this sense of belonging, using this cultural diplomacy framework more in channels or forms of manifestations that were not typically instruments of states before, I think it's essential to create again with them this sense of belonging and participation and ambassadorship. So that would be one thought that I want to leave you with. And then the other is that it's also, we are, both the European Union and the Balkans, we are an aging continent. And I think we talk about this too little, or we face it, we shy away from this aspect. Our average age is around 44. I think Macedonia, Serbia, it's around that, plus minus 1-2 years. While in comparison, for example, let's take almost any African country, but Niger, for example, has half of the population younger than 15. So in very practical terms, what's going to happen is that we're going to see an Africa that's going to double in size. It's going to have, by 2050, 2 billion, 2.5 billion people. And in our continent, like the European Union, is going to be about 500 million. We had, hopefully by 2050, that's going to include the Western Balkans, well, around that number as well. Which means that for multinational companies that are cross-border, for the type of information that is consumed, for the type of technologies that are used, we're going to have this huge unbalance created not by different strategies of these countries, but created by very, very, very different demographics. And I think that needs to be taken into consideration in the relationship between continents as well, in a sense. And I think we're going to see a flow of migration coming on the continent as well, because of the different age, because of the demographics, and because of the big shifts that are going to happen in the labor market. Not just because we're going to be like the pyramid of ages is very different, and more of us are going to need younger labor force to sustain the pension system, but also because more of the industry, more of the economy is going to be embedded by technologies that are easier used with generations that are now emerging. And we're going to see more action there, maybe more conversation, more power than it typically had, in a sense. And what we see in terms of institution, political candidates, the way decisions are being made is less representation. So I think this debalance can be tackled and moved to the advantage of a multicultural model through cultural ambassadorship and diplomacy, but targeted in those different channels with those different ambassadors to that generation. I think that that's something worth taking into consideration. And again, I think it plays out in very practical terms as well. Like, one of the targets we now have as a country is to join the Schengen area. We're very upset that this hasn't been before. We feel a bit that it plays out a bit the conversation of multi-speed Europe, and not in the way we would prefer it to be. So Romania is it's a very special moment for us in terms of the Schengen area. And apparently the negotiations or the decision framework, the institutional decision framework, isn't working as fast or as fair as we would like it to be. But in the same time, we had, weeks ago, there was a group of German citizens biking. They were just biking close to the seashore. And they just kept on biking until they ended up in Romania without any border check. And the police, at some point, figured out they're there, stopped them, asked them for their IDs, they gave their passports, and they were like, but how did you enter the country? And they were like, we're just biking. They were biking from Bulgaria. I was like, how did you avoid the border control? It was like, I don't know, we were just biking on the field. We were sure there's no border there, so we were just continuing with our casual biking ride. So now they have a criminal record. That's the sad part of the story. But in a sense, their perception of if we are in this region, if we are in this space, if we are friends with each other, if we're in the same safe space, then obviously I don't need to do any bureaucracy to just keep on biking. I think that's the collective imagination that needs to be fed into more and used more, because that's going to change, I think, the votes and the decisions of national entities. And with this, I will also end, and I would truly hope that we have the space for questions and conversations, either in the panel or in the coffee break. But when I ran, so I don't come from politics. I come from a space of social entrepreneurship. I ended up in the government because we had a technocrat government in 2016, and then I went on to build a new political party. Obviously, not by myself, and there were a lot of people engaged in that. But what surprised me is that in every campaign that I was part of, when I had young people in the room, they were never asking just national questions. They would always ask, what do you want to do with the refugees from Syria? What's your opinion on the rights of women in Iran? What is it that you're going to do exactly with... they would always have concerns that were in the top of their questions when they were coming to discuss with us whether they vote for us or not in local and national elections. So it's not, because their universe of information, their universe of conversations, but especially their universe of empathy and what do they care about, is rarely confined within their border. And that's why I think they can be maybe one of the main ambassadors of a world that handles this polycrisis that we're having, not in a way of centralizing decision, but in a way of fast synchronizing multilateral perspectives, so that we move fast, but without giving away power to just centralized units. Thank you.